The workmen had already carried the harp out into the drive by the time the carriage reached the gate, and Eleanor watched it go past the window without letting her face move at all. She had spent 3 days practicing that stillness. It was not a talent so much as a discipline, the kind you built the way you built calluses. And by the time the carriage stopped at the servants' entrance of Larkspur Hall, she had it fixed firmly enough that when the housekeeper asked her name, she answered without a tremor. "Nell Hartley," she said. "I've come about the position." It was not her name. It had not been her name for 11 days, ever since she'd sat at the small writing desk in her rented room above the milliner's shop and decided, with the particular calm of someone who has run out of other decisions, that Eleanor Fairfax would need to disappear for a while so that someone else could go back into the house that had once belonged to her. The housekeeper, a broad, unhurried woman named Mrs. Pemberton, looked her over with the practical eye of someone who had hired a great many girls and been disappointed by most of them. "You've references?" "From a Mrs. Colston in Bath." The letter was genuine enough in that a Mrs. Colston existed and had in fact once employed Eleanor's former governess, who had written it out of loyalty and a fair amount of risk. "I've done companion work. Reading, correspondence, some mending. His Grace's aunt is difficult," Mrs. Pemberton said, which Eleanor understood to mean this was a warning rather than a discouragement. The kind housekeepers gave to girls they had already decided to keep. Lady Prescott doesn't hold with idleness, and she doesn't hold with chatter, and she does not care to be read to in a voice she calls affected, whatever that means to her. You'll find out, I understand. Mrs. Pemberton studied her a moment longer, the way people sometimes did when something about a face didn't quite match its explanation, and Eleanor made herself hold still through it, the way she'd held still, watching the harp go past the window, the way she'd been holding still for the better part of a year now, since the solicitor had come to Rosewell with his papers and his careful, apologetic voice and explained to her, as if it were a kindness, that the estate could not pass to a daughter, that her father's cousin held the entail, and that arrangements had already been made. She had not fully believed, even then, that the arrangements meant what they turned out to mean. She had believed her mother's small fortune, at least, was safe, settled on her by marriage contract, untouchable by entail or cousin or anyone else. She had believed it right up until Cornelius Fairfax sat across from her, with a document bearing what he called her own signature, releasing her claim to it, dated a full year before she'd have had any reason to sign such a thing, in a hand that was almost, but not quite, hers. She had not been able to prove it was false. That was the trouble with almost. Almost did not hold up in front of men who wanted it to be exactly right. So she had gone, first to Bath, then here, to the one place she could think to look for what she needed, which was the house itself. Because whatever her uncle had done with her mother's money, he had not thought to search the house before he sold it, being a man who had never once in his life looked closely enough at anything to know what mattered in it. And Eleanor had grown up in that house. She knew exactly where her mother used to keep things that mattered. "You'll start in the morning," Mrs. Pemberton said. "Mind you're punctual. His Grace doesn't care for a household that runs late." Eleanor had not yet seen the Duke of Rothmere, and standing now in the passage that led to the servants' hall, in a house she had once run through barefoot with her hair loose down her back, she found she did not much care to. She had built a plan that required avoiding him as thoroughly as possible, and she intended to keep to it. The plan lasted 4 days. It fell apart, in the end, over a door. There was a small sitting room on the second floor, tucked between the library and what had once been her mother's morning room, with a panel beside the fireplace that did not look like a door at all unless you already knew it was one. Eleanor had discovered it at 9 years old, chasing a ball of yarn behind the wing chair, and had spent the better part of a summer convinced she'd found something magical before her mother, laughing, explained it was only a linen press built into the wall by a previous owner who disliked visible storage. It was where her mother had kept the small carved box with the good lace, and Eleanor had gone looking for it on her third evening at Larkspur Hall, when she was meant to be fetching a shawl for Lady Prescott, and instead found herself alone in the sitting room with her hand already on the seam of the panel before she'd entirely decided to do it. She had it open when the door behind her opened too. "That's not a wall," said a voice, mild and unhurried, and Eleanor turned to find a tall man in the doorway, dark-haired, dressed plainly for evening, watching her with an expression she could not immediately read. Most people don't know that. She had not seen him before, not properly, only at a distance across the dining hall when the family dined and the companions did not, but she understood at once, from the way the footman behind him deferred and withdrew, that this was the Duke. "I was looking for a shawl, Your Grace," she said, which was true, if not complete. "I believe I mistook the room." "You didn't mistake anything," he said. "You went straight to it." He came further into the room, unhurried, and looked at the open panel with an interest that had nothing accusing in it, which unsettled her more than accusation would have. "I've owned this house 2 years, and I found that door by accident, moving a bookcase. How does a lady's companion, 4 days in my employ, know where it is without looking?" Eleanor's mind moved very fast and produced nothing useful. "A lucky guess, Your Grace. The proportions of the room seemed wrong. Did they?" He did not sound as though he believed her, but he also did not press it, which was somehow worse, because she understood then that he was a man who collected things that didn't add up and waited, rather than one who demanded answers on the spot. "Mrs. Pemberton tells me you're punctual and quiet, and give her no trouble. I find I'm curious what you're quiet about." "Nothing worth Your Grace's curiosity." "That," he said, "is exactly what someone would say who was." He left without pressing further, and Eleanor stood in the sitting room with her heart going harder than it had any business going, and understood that avoiding the Duke of Rothmere was no longer a workable plan, because he had apparently decided, in the space of one strange conversation, that she was worth watching. She saw him more after that, not because she sought him out, but because he seemed, without ever quite explaining it, to arrange to be in rooms she was in. He would ask her opinion on a book Lady Prescott had abandoned half-read. He would mention, in passing, some detail of the house's history, and watch her face while he said it, the way you'd watch someone's face for a flinch. Once he described the walled garden by a name, the quiet garden his old gardener had apparently called it, and Eleanor, before she could stop herself, said, "We used to call it the green room," and then went very still, because she had said "we" and she had said "used," and both of those words told him things she had not meant to tell him. He did not remark on it. He only looked at her a moment longer than was comfortable, and changed the subject to something about the roses, and Eleanor understood that he had noticed and filed it away, and would bring it out again later when it suited him. It was a strange thing, being watched so carefully by someone who never once was unkind about it. She had braced herself, coming into this house, for the ordinary cruelties of service. The sharp words, the assumption of stupidity, the particular contempt some households had for girls who worked for their bread. Lady Prescott gave her a little of that, in a brittle, tired way that came more from grief than malice. Eleanor came to understand, since the old woman had buried a husband and 2 sons, and had very little left to be gentle about. But the Duke was not cruel. The Duke was worse, in a way. The Duke was attentive. He asked her, one evening in October, why she never spoke of her family. "There's little to tell, Your Grace." "I don't think that's true. I think there's a great deal to tell, and you've decided not to tell it, which is a different thing entirely." He was not looking at her when he said it, arranging papers on the library table, his tone almost idle. "I don't ask to press you. I ask because I find I mind not knowing, which is unusual for me. I generally don't mind not knowing things about people in my employ. Perhaps I'm simply not very interesting, Your Grace." "You corrected the date on a portrait in the gallery last week," he said. "Told Mrs. Pemberton the 3rd Earl of Rosewell died in 1791, not 1793. And when she asked how you knew, you said you'd read it somewhere. I've owned that portrait's history for 2 years and never once looked up the date, because I had no reason to care about it. You did. That's not nothing." Eleanor felt something in her chest go very tight. She had not thought anyone was listening to that exchange. "It was a guess, Your Grace. A great many of your guesses are exact," he said, and then more quietly, not unkindly at all, "I'm not trying to catch you in anything, Miss Hartley. I want that understood. Whatever you're carrying, I'm not asking you to put it down for my convenience. I only want you to know that I've noticed you're carrying it, and that I don't think less of you for it." She did not answer that. She could not, without her voice doing something she did not want it to do. And he seemed to understand that too, because he let the silence sit and did not fill it, and went back to his papers and did not raise the subject again that night. She thought, walking back to her small room afterward, that it would have been much easier if the Duke of Rothmere had been the sort of man she'd expected. Careless, or cold, or too occupied with his own consequence to notice a companion at all. It would have made the plan simpler. It would have made it much easier to leave, when leaving became necessary, without minding the leaving quite so much. She found the box in November, not the lace box. That, when she finally worked up the courage to search the old linen press properly, held nothing but yellowed cloth and a moth-eaten ribbon that made her throat ache with a grief she'd thought she'd finished having. But behind the press, in a gap between the wall and the paneling that she remembered her mother sealing with wax paper against the damp, her fingers found a flat wooden case, and inside it, wrapped in oilcloth, a bundle of letters and a folded document with her mother's seal. She read it by candlelight in her room, with the door bolted, and by the 3rd page she understood that her mother, who had never trusted her husband's cousin any further than politeness required, had drawn up a private trust for Eleanor's dowry the year before her death, separate from the marriage settlement, held not by the estate but by a solicitor in London, whose name meant nothing to Eleanor, but whose signature, alongside her mother's, was unmistakably genuine, dated years before any document Cornelius Fairfax had ever produced. It did not undo what had been taken, but it proved, in ink that could not be argued with, that the release her uncle held was a forgery, because the funds it claimed to release had never legally been his to control in the first place. She sat with the document a long time before she understood what to do with it, and by morning she still hadn't decided, because the only man with the standing and the resources to move quickly against Cornelius Fairfax was a man she had spent 3 months carefully not telling anything true. Cornelius Fairfax arrived at Larkspur Hall on the 2nd Tuesday of December, and Eleanor learned of it only when Mrs. Pemberton mentioned, without any particular weight, that his Grace had a caller. A Mr. Fairfax, come about some business matter left over from the sale of the estate 2 years prior. Eleanor was in the corridor outside the drawing-room, with an armful of linen, when the door opened and her uncle stepped out into the hall, and there was nowhere at all to go. He looked at her the way he had always looked at her, as though she were an inconvenience that had briefly resurfaced. Then his expression changed, sharpened, and he said her name, her real name, in a voice pitched exactly loud enough to be heard. "Eleanor." He said it almost with satisfaction, the tone of a man discovering he held a card he hadn't known was in his hand. "Well, I did wonder where you'd got to." She felt the linen slide against her arms and did not trust herself to speak. "You'll want to come with me," he said, stepping closer, lowering his voice now to something meant only for her. "Quietly, if you please, unless you'd like His Grace to learn exactly what kind of girl he's had dusting his library, working under a false name, in the house of a man who doesn't know who you are. That's not the behavior of an innocent party, Eleanor. And I don't imagine a duke cares to discover he's been deceived." "I haven't deceived him about anything that concerns him," Eleanor said, and was startled by how steady her own voice came out. "He'll be the judge of that, I think, once." "Once what?" said the Duke. From the drawing-room doorway, Eleanor had not heard him come to it. Cornelius Fairfax's face did the particular collapsing thing that faces did when a plan built on privacy met an audience it hadn't accounted for, and he recovered himself with visible effort, straightening his coat. "Your Grace, this is a family matter, I assure you, nothing that need concern the running of your household." "It concerns my household considerably," the Duke said, "since it appears to concern a member of it. Eleanor." He said the name, her name, the real one, carefully, as though testing whether it fit, and then looked at her directly, and there was nothing in his face that resembled the cold discovery she'd braced for. "Eleanor Fairfax, of Rosewell." "Yes," she said. "I had begun to suspect something of the kind. I hadn't quite arrived at Rosewell." He turned back to her uncle with an entirely different expression, one Eleanor had not yet seen on him, precise and very cold. "Mr. Fairfax, you'll forgive me if I say I find it curious that a young woman working quietly under an assumed name in my house should provoke threats from her own uncle the moment he discovers her rather than relief. Most families, finding a lost niece, are glad of it." "You don't understand the situation, Your Grace." "Then explain it to me." "Carefully. In my study, I think, rather than my front hall." He glanced at Eleanor once more, and something in the glance told her to stay near, though he did not say it aloud. "Miss Fairfax, if you have anything in writing that bears on this business, I should very much like to see it before Mr. Fairfax and I finish our conversation." She went and got the box. It took the better part of 2 hours in the Duke's study with the solicitor sent for, and Cornelius Fairfax growing steadily less composed as each document was laid on the table beside the forged release he had, with foolish confidence, brought along to press his advantage. The trust document, once compared against the release, made the forgery plain even to eyes untrained in such things. The seal alone told the story, since Eleanor's mother's true seal, preserved on the trust, bore a small flaw in the wax mold that the forged release did not reproduce. Cornelius Fairfax left Larkspur Hall considerably before dinner, considerably less confident than he had arrived, and considerably more aware that a duke with a solicitor and an afternoon to spare was not an obstacle he had the resources to outlast. Alexander did not go to find Eleanor until the house had gone quiet, and when he did, he found her in the small sitting room with the linen press, sitting in the wing chair with her hands folded very still in her lap, in the particular way of someone who has spent a great many months learning to hold still, and has just, for the first time, let herself stop. "You might have told me," he said, settling into the chair across from her, not accusing, only tired in the way people are tired after a long day of being careful. "Any time in the last 3 months." "I was afraid of exactly what happened this afternoon," she said. "That once you knew who I was, you'd see a girl who'd lied to you, rather than a girl who'd had very little choice." "I saw a girl," he said, "who knew where a door was that no one else in this house had found in 2 years, who corrected a portrait's date because she couldn't help herself, who called a garden by a name only a person who'd loved it as a child would use. I had already decided, well before this afternoon, that whatever you were carrying, I wanted to help you carry it. I was only waiting for you to trust me enough to let me." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment and found to her own surprise that the stillness she had practiced so carefully these last months had finally quietly stopped being necessary. "I don't know how to be Eleanor Fairfax again," she said. "I've been someone else for so long I'm not certain I remember how the first one behaved." "Badly, I should think," he said, and there was warmth in it now, the first real warmth she'd let herself notice. "Corrected everyone's portraits, knew all the secret doors, called gardens by the wrong names on purpose, probably, just to see who'd argue with her." "That does sound like her," Eleanor admitted, and something in her chest, held tight since a solicitor's careful apologetic voice at Rosewell more than a year ago, finally came loose. "Then I should like to meet her properly," Alexander said. "Whenever she's ready. I find I've rather grown fond of the version who hid in my linen presses, but I understand she has an original to introduce me to." The trust, once its provenance was confirmed by the London solicitor named within it, restored to Eleanor a fortune her uncle had spent 2 years believing safely beyond her reach, along with a good deal of the standing that had gone with it. She did not go back to Rosewell. That house belonged now to strangers, and she found, examining the feeling carefully, that she did not much mourn it. What she minded keeping was smaller and stranger. The door behind the linen press, the garden, with its old name, a study where a man had once looked at a girl hiding a secret, and decided, patiently, without ever once demanding it of her, to wait until she was ready to hand it over herself. He asked her properly in the spring, in the walled garden, using the name she had taught him for it, and she said yes before he had entirely finished the question. And afterward they stood a long while by the old stone wall in the last of the light, in no hurry at all, the way people stand who have already decided they have all the time they could want.